Hey there. Tonight we begin with a journey into the concealed spaces within medieval castles, where secret chambers, hidden passages and mysterious rooms contained everything from treasure hoards to imprisoned enemies, where the architecture of power included not just the visible towers and halls, but also the invisible spaces known only to a few, where the walls held secrets that could determine the fate of kingdoms, and where the romance of hidden chambers met the harsh realities of medieval warfare, politics and survival. From the treasure vaults hidden behind false walls, to the escape tunnels leading beyond castle boundaries, from the oubliettes where prisoners disappeared into darkness, to the priest holes where religious dissidents hid from persecution, from the spy passages that allowed lords to overhear conversations to the storage rooms for documents too sensitive to keep in plain sight. The story of castle hidden spaces reveals that medieval fortresses were far more complex than their exterior appearances suggested, with entire hidden geographies existing within stone walls that served purposes ranging from practical security to political intrigue to simple survival when castles came under siege or threat. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here. And let those comments know where the listening is happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about castle hidden rooms, imagination immediately leaps to treasure chambers, secret escape routes, and dungeons where prisoners languished in darkness. These romantic notions have some basis in historical reality. Castles did contain hidden spaces serving various purposes, but the truth is both more mundane and more fascinating than popular imagination suggests. Medieval castle builders incorporated concealed spaces, passages and rooms into their designs for practical reasons related to security, defence, administration, and the political realities of medieval life where privacy, secrecy, and secure storage were matters of survival rather than mere convenience. The necessity for hidden spaces arose from multiple concerns. Castles housed not just families but also treasures, documents, weapons, prisoners, and secrets that required protection beyond what visible defences could provide. The internal architecture of castles reflected the reality that threats came not just from external siege, but also from internal betrayal, from servants who might spy, from guests who might be enemies, and from the general medieval understanding that information, valuables, and certain people needed to be kept secure through concealment as much as through visible strength. Picture this. A castle in England, perhaps around 1400. The lord has returned from campaign with substantial plunder, gold, jewels, important prisoners who might be ransomed. He also possesses documents relating to delicate political negotiations that could prove dangerous if discovered. His castle appears from outside to be simple military fortress, but within the thick walls exists a hidden geography. Behind what appears to be solid stone in the great tower lies a chamber where the most valuable treasures are stored. A section of apparently solid wall in the Lord's chamber actually swings open to reveal a passage leading to an exit beyond the castle walls, providing escape route if the castle falls. Below the main dungeons, accessible only through a concealed entrance, lies an oubliette where particularly important or dangerous prisoners are held, in conditions so secret that many castle residents don't know these prisoners exist. The castle is two castles, the visible one that everyone sees, and the hidden one known only to the Lord and his most trusted servants. Tonight's journey explores what these hidden castle spaces actually contained. The treasure rooms where valuables were secured, the escape passages that provided last resort routes to safety, the secret prisons where important captives disappeared from history, the hidden chapels serving religious or political purposes, the weapons caches positioned for defence, the spy passages allowing surveillance, the storage for sensitive documents, and the various other concealed spaces that made castles far more architecturally complex than their exteriors suggested. From the practical engineering of these hidden spaces to the historical examples that survive and the purposes they served, the story reveals how medieval builders created invisible architecture serving purposes that open spaces couldn't accommodate. The treasure rooms hidden within castle walls represented perhaps the most valuable and carefully concealed spaces, containing wealth that could fund armies, pay ransoms, or support families through crises. Understanding how treasuries were hidden and what they contained reveals both the wealth medieval nobles commanded and the constant anxiety about theft that made elaborate concealment necessary. The visible treasuries that castles often possessed served partly as decoys. These known strong rooms, typically in towers or heavily fortified areas, contained valuables and were secured with massive doors, multiple locks, and constant guard presence. Yet the truly valuable items, the emergency reserves, the most precious jewels, the largest quantities of gold and silver, were often kept elsewhere in spaces whose very existence was secret, known only to the lord and perhaps one or two completely trusted retainers. The construction of hidden treasuries required sophisticated engineering. The spaces were typically built into the fabric of walls during original construction or during major renovations, creating chambers that appeared from both sides to be simply thick masonry. The entrances were disguised as decorative elements, as parts of fireplaces, as sections of wall that looked identical to surrounding stonework, but that could be opened by those who knew the mechanism. Some hidden treasuries were accessible only through other hidden passages, creating layered concealment that would protect treasures even if one secret was discovered. The contents of these hidden treasuries varied, but typically included the most valuable and most portable wealth. Gold and silver coins, stored in chests or simply in piles, represented the most liquid form of wealth that could be quickly converted to other uses. The precious metals could pay soldiers, purchase supplies, fund political operations, or support the family if other income sources were disrupted. The quantity of coin in major noble treasuries could be substantial. Inventories from royal treasuries mentioned thousands of pounds in gold and silver. The jewellery and precious objects represented wealth in concentrated portable form. Crowns, coronets, elaborate necklaces, rings set with precious stones, brooches decorated with gems. All these combined intrinsic value in their materials with artistic value in their craftsmanship. The finest pieces might be identifiable and therefore difficult to sell without raising questions, but they could be broken down for their metal and gems if necessary, making them flexible stores of value. The jewellery also served ceremonial purposes for those occasions when display of wealth was necessary. The plate, dishes, cups, candlesticks, and various implements made from gold or silver combined utility with value. These objects served practical purposes at feasts and ceremonies, while being literally made of precious metal that could be weighed and valued precisely. The inventories of plate from great households mention hundreds of items, from simple spoons to elaborate serving dishes, collectively worth substantial fortunes. The storage of plate in hidden treasuries protected it from theft, while keeping it available for ceremonial use when needed. The religious objects kept in some treasuries included reliquaries, sacred vessels, and other items that combined spiritual significance with material value. Some families possessed relics of saints that were spiritually precious regardless of material worth, while the reliquaries containing them were often masterpieces of goldsmith's art encrusted with jewels. The mixing of sacred and secular treasures in some hidden chambers reflects the medieval understanding that spiritual and material value were not separate categories. The specific protection methods for treasuries included not just concealment, but also traps and hazards. Some hidden treasury chambers had only one entrance through which a person could barely fit, making it difficult for thieves to remove large items quickly. Others had doors designed to be impossible to open from inside, trapping anyone who entered without proper knowledge. Some treasuries included false floors concealing spike pits or other hazards that would injure thieves attempting to force entry. The lethal seriousness of these protections demonstrates how valuable the contents were, and how far lords would go to protect them. The documentation of treasury contents was itself sensitive. The detailed inventories that recorded exactly what was stored were often themselves kept hidden, as knowledge of treasury contents would be valuable to thieves or enemies. Some lords kept these records in code, or kept partial inventories in different locations so that no single document revealed the full extent of their wealth. The information security around treasuries was as important as physical security. The access protocols for treasuries involved multiple keys held by different people, or complex lock mechanisms requiring special knowledge to open, or physical barriers that could only be moved by several strong men working together. The multiple layers of access control ensured that no single person could easily steal from treasuries, and that accessing them required coordination that would be noticed if unauthorized The trust required to share treasury access was profound, with the betrayal of that trust being potentially devastating. The emergency access provisions ensured that treasuries could be reached quickly if crisis demanded, despite the normal security measures. A lord facing siege or political crisis might need immediate access to wealth to pay soldiers, to flee with portable assets, or to secure political support. The treasury design balanced security during normal times with accessibility during emergencies, sometimes including special mechanisms that could be activated only in specific circumstances. The legendary treasuries that stories described often exceeded what actually existed, yet the tales were based on real wealth. The stories of King John's treasure lost in the wash, the supposed treasures of the Knights Templar, the various legendary hoards said to be hidden in specific castles. All these tales probably began with real treasuries and real wealth that over time became exaggerated into legendary proportions, yet even the documented treasuries from surviving records demonstrate that the wealthy nobles commanded resources that most people couldn't imagine. The discovery of hidden treasuries, whether by accident during renovations or by deliberate search during conflicts, occasionally occurred. The finding of previously unknown chambers containing valuables sometimes happened when castles changed hands, or when building work exposed previously hidden spaces. These discoveries demonstrated that the concealment had been effective enough that knowledge of the spaces was lost, while also revealing what had been considered worth hiding so carefully. The modern investigations using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies sometimes identify hidden chambers in surviving castles. These technological investigations reveal that many castles likely contain undiscovered spaces whose existence was lost when the families who knew about them died out or when records were destroyed. The possibility that treasuries still exist undiscovered in castle walls tantalizes treasure hunters and historians, while remaining largely unproven. Understanding hidden treasuries reveals the practical medieval concern with wealth security and the sophisticated methods developed to protect assets that represented not just personal wealth, but also political power and family security. The treasuries weren't merely storage spaces, but were crucial components of medieval power structures, ensuring that resources existed to survive crises, to fund military operations, to maintain political position, and to pass wealth to subsequent generations despite the constant threats of theft, siege, confiscation, and the various other ways that wealth could be lost in medieval's violent and uncertain world. The hidden passages leading from castles to external locations represented perhaps the most romanticized features of castle architecture, yet they served serious practical purposes. Understanding escape routes and sally ports reveals how castle builders planned for the possibility of defeat and siege, while also creating tactical advantages that hidden exits provided during conflicts. The escape tunnel's basic purpose was straightforward. If the castle was besieged and capture became inevitable, the lord and his family could flee through hidden passages that enemies wouldn't know about, potentially reaching safety before the castle fell. The historical record documents numerous instances where besieged nobles did escape through such passages, making them proven practical features rather than mere architectural fantasies. The construction challenges for escape passages were substantial. The tunnels needed to extend from inside the castle, beneath walls or through secret gates, to external locations far enough away that people exiting wouldn't immediately be captured. The engineering required digging through solid rock in many cases, or tunnelling beneath moats and water defences, or creating passages through existing walls that wouldn't be detected from either internal or external observation. The scale of work required meant that escape passages were significant construction projects that could take years to complete. The concealment of passage entrances within castles required similar ingenuity to treasury concealment. The entrance might be hidden behind decorative panelling, beneath floor stones that could be lifted, within fireplaces with false backs, or in private chambers where only family members regularly entered. The best concealed entrances looked completely natural from inside, giving no indication that they led anywhere beyond the room they appeared to be in. The locations were chosen to be accessible from private areas, where the family could reach them without being observed by potential traitors within the household. The passages themselves varied considerably in size and sophistication. Some were barely large enough for a person to crawl through, creating uncomfortable but functional escape routes that prioritise concealment over comfort. Others were larger passages that allowed upright walking or even the passage of small groups, though these larger passages were more difficult to conceal and more expensive to construct. The passage dimensions reflected the balance between functionality and the feasibility of construction and concealment. The lighting within escape passages was usually minimal or non-existent. Some passages included small air shafts that admitted limited light, but many were completely dark, requiring escapees to navigate by touch or by carrying lights that wouldn't be visible from outside. The darkness added to the challenge of using these passages during emergencies, when stress and time pressure made navigation difficult even in familiar spaces. The knowledge of passage routes needed to be memorized, as carrying maps or guides created risks that the information would be discovered. The exits from escape passages required careful positioning. The ideal exit was sufficiently far from the castle that escapees could avoid immediate capture. It was concealed by natural features like forest, rocky terrain, or buildings, and provided access to routes leading to friendly territories or places of refuge. Some passages exited into nearby buildings that appeared unconnected to the castle, allowing escapees to emerge inside structures where they wouldn't be immediately visible. Others exited into natural features like caves or rocky outcrops that provided concealment. The maintenance challenges for escape passages were significant. Underground passages could flood, could suffer cave-ins, or could become blocked by debris. The passages needed periodic inspection and maintenance to remain functional, yet this maintenance had to be done discreetly to avoid revealing their existence. Some passages that were built but then inadequately maintained became unusable over time, failing when they were actually needed during sieges. The strategic uses of passages extended beyond simple escape. The sally port, a hidden or secondary gate, allowed defenders to emerge unexpectedly from the castle, to attack besiegers, to gather intelligence about enemy positions, or to receive supplies and reinforcements that couldn't come through main gates. The offensive use of sally ports made them valuable tactical features that could break sieges, or at least make them more costly for attackers. The historical accounts of sieges frequently mention sorties through hidden gates that caught besiegers by surprise. The famous examples of escape passages include some that are well documented. Dover Castle in England has medieval passages leading beyond its walls. Edinburgh Castle in Scotland has passages cut through solid rock. The castles along the Rhine in Germany often included passages leading to riverbanks. These surviving examples demonstrate that what might seem like romantic fiction was actually practical military architecture that builders incorporated into fortifications across medieval Europe. The legendary passages that folklore described often exceeded what actually existed. Many castles have traditional stories about tunnels leading for miles to distant locations, about passages connecting multiple castles, or about elaborate underground networks. Most of these legendary passages probably never existed. The engineering required would have been far beyond medieval capabilities, and the effort would have been unjustifiable. Yet the legends demonstrate cultural awareness that some passages were real, and the imaginative extrapolation from documented reality to exaggerated legend. The discoveries of previously unknown passages occasionally occur during restoration work or archaeological investigation of castle sites. These findings sometimes confirm traditional stories about hidden passages, while in other cases revealing exits and entrances that had been completely forgotten. The discovery of passages demonstrates that the concealment was effective enough that knowledge was lost over time, while also showing that the passages were substantial enough to survive centuries without maintenance. The limitations of escape passages meant they couldn't save everyone in the castle, only a select few who could navigate the passages quickly. The decision about who would use passages during emergencies, family members, key retainers, valuable prisoners or hostages, reflected cruel calculus about who was most worth saving when not everyone could escape. The existence of escape passages meant that while castles might fall and most occupants might be captured or killed, the lord and his immediate family had better chances of survival that ordinary residents didn't share. The betrayal risks surrounding escape passages meant that knowledge of them had to be carefully restricted. A traitor who knew about escape passages could reveal them to enemies, could guide attackers through them to gain entry, or could ambush escapees at exit points. The trust required to share knowledge of passages was profound, and the consequences of misplaced trust could be catastrophic. Some lords apparently kept passage knowledge so restricted that even family members didn't know about them, creating risks that passages couldn't be used effectively if the Lord himself was incapacitated. Understanding escape passages and sally ports reveals that medieval castle builders incorporated pessimistic realism into their designs. They planned for the possibility that their defences would fail, and that escape might be necessary. The passages represented insurance policies against defeat, last resort features that hopefully wouldn't be needed, but that could prove life-saving in worst-case scenarios. The hidden routes connecting castle interiors to external freedom were simultaneously practical military features and powerful symbols of the constant insecurity that characterized medieval life, where even within massive fortifications, survival might ultimately depend on hidden paths known only to a few. The most sinister hidden spaces in castles were the secret prisons, particularly the oubliettes, literally forgotten places where prisoners could be held in conditions so isolated that they might as well have ceased to exist. Understanding these spaces reveals the darker aspects of medieval justice and the political uses of imprisonment that required concealment beyond ordinary dungeons. The oubliette in its classic form was a small cell accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling. The prisoner would be lowered down and the trapdoor closed, leaving them in darkness with no way to climb out. The space would be just large enough to sit or lie down, creating conditions of extreme confinement. The prisoner's only contact with the world would be when the trapdoor opened to lower food or to remove waste, assuming the captors bothered with such maintenance. The name oubliette reflects their purpose. These were places where prisoners were forgotten, left to die slowly out of sight and mind. The historical reality of oubliettes is somewhat disputed by scholars. While castle dungeons certainly existed and some castles have chambers that appear to match oubliette descriptions, the extent to which these spaces were actually used as permanent imprisonment locations versus temporary holding cells or storage spaces remains debated. The Romantic Gothic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries probably exaggerated both the prevalence and the horror of oubliettes beyond what medieval reality involved, yet some spaces clearly were used for harsh imprisonment, even if they weren't always permanent death sentences that the term oubliette suggests. The documented secret prisons that definitely existed served specific purposes distinct from ordinary dungeons. These hidden cells held prisoners whose imprisonment needed to remain secret, political rivals whose disappearance was expedient, enemies whose knowledge made them too dangerous to release, but whose execution would create problems, hostages whose existence needed to be deniable. The secret nature of these imprisonments meant that prisoners could be held indefinitely without legal process, without outside intervention, and without the awareness of people who might petition for their release. The construction of secret prisons involved building cells within castle walls, beneath floors, or in other locations where their existence wouldn't be obvious. The access points were concealed, sometimes requiring passage through multiple hidden doors or through secret passages to reach the actual cells. The sounds from these prisons had to be isolated so that prisoners' cries wouldn't be heard in inhabited areas, requiring thick walls or strategic positioning far from normal traffic patterns. The architectural challenge was creating spaces secure enough to hold prisoners while hidden enough to deny their existence. The conditions in these hidden prisons were typically horrific even by medieval dungeon standards. The lack of light, the inadequate ventilation, the confinement in spaces too small for proper movement, the isolation from any human contact, all these created psychological torture alongside physical deprivation. Prisoners held in such conditions would deteriorate rapidly both mentally and physically. The historical accounts from prisoners who survived such imprisonment describe experiences that amounted to being buried alive while still breathing. The famous prisoners held in secret locations included some significant historical figures. The man in the iron mask, whether or not the popular legend is accurate, represented the type of mysterious prisoner that secret castle cells were designed to hold, someone whose identity and knowledge made them too dangerous to release or to imprison openly. Various political rivals who disappeared from historical records may have spent years in hidden castle prisons before dying obscurely. The historical gaps around certain individuals' fates sometimes suggest imprisonment in conditions so secret that records either never existed or were destroyed. The purposes of hidden imprisonment extended beyond simple punishment or even elimination. Some prisoners were held as bargaining chips for future negotiations, kept alive as long as they might prove useful, but held in conditions where they couldn't communicate or escape. Others were imprisoned as insurance against political reversals. If fortunes changed, the hidden prisoner could be produced as evidence of having captured enemies, or could be quietly eliminated if their existence became inconvenient. The flexible uses of secret imprisonment made it a valuable political tool. The legal and moral questions surrounding secret imprisonment were recognised even in medieval periods. The Magna Carta's provisions about imprisonment without due process reflected awareness that arbitrary imprisonment was a problem. The Church opposed certain forms of imprisonment, though enforcement was limited. Yet the practical political realities of medieval power meant that lords who controlled castles could and did imprison people secretly regardless of legal or moral prohibitions. The lack of higher authority capable of enforcing restrictions meant that castle lords had nearly absolute power over those they imprisoned. The discovery of remains in hidden castle chambers during archaeological investigations occasionally reveals evidence of imprisonment that wasn't documented. The skeletal remains found walled up within castle structures, found in sealed chambers, or found in conditions suggesting they died while confined, provide material evidence that some people were imprisoned in circumstances that aren't recorded in chronicles or documents. These archaeological findings demonstrate that undocumented imprisonment occurred, though the scale and frequency remain unclear. The survival from secret imprisonment was rare but not impossible. Some prisoners were eventually released when political circumstances changed, when their captors died and successors didn't maintain the imprisonment, or when knowledge of their imprisonment reached authorities who intervened. The accounts from survivors describe conditions designed to break prisoners psychologically as much as physically, with the isolation and uncertainty about fate being as torturous as any physical deprivation. The practical management of secret prisoners required trusted servants who would maintain the imprisonment, provide minimal necessities, and crucially maintain secrecy. The trust required was profound. These servants literally held power of life and death, and possessed knowledge that could be politically explosive if revealed. Some lords apparently used deaf-mute servants for such purposes, ensuring that the servants physically couldn't communicate what they knew, even if they wished to betray their master's secrets. The transition points when secret prisons were abandoned often came during sieges, during changes of ownership, or during the decline of castles as primary residences. When new owners took possession of castles, they sometimes discovered prisoners that previous owners had concealed. When castles were abandoned, prisoners left behind would die unless someone released them. The historical records include occasional mentions of prisoners found during castle transfers, suggesting that such discoveries happened with enough frequency to be noteworthy, but probably not rare. Understanding secret prisons and oubliettes reveals the darkest applications of castle architecture. Spaces designed not for defence, or for comfortable living, but specifically for causing suffering, while preventing any knowledge of that suffering from reaching the outside world. These hidden cells represented the absolute power that medieval lords wielded within their domains, and the limited recourse that their victims had against arbitrary imprisonment. The spaces were carefully engineered cruelty, combining architectural sophistication with moral darkness in creating places where people could be erased from the world, while technically still being alive within castle walls. The hidden chapels and religious spaces within castles served purposes ranging from personal devotion in private to sheltering persecuted religious minorities during periods of religious conflict. Understanding these concealed sacred spaces reveals both the importance of religion in medieval and early modern life, and the ways religious identity could be dangerous enough to require concealment. The private chapels that many castles possessed were often known public spaces, but some castles also had hidden chapels accessible only to family members or to select individuals. These secret sacred spaces served lords who wanted private religious observance without the formality of public chapel services, who possessed relics or sacred objects requiring secure storage, or who simply valued having space for contemplation away from the constant activity of castle life. The hidden chapel provided spiritual refuge that visible spaces couldn't offer. The construction of hidden chapels involved creating properly consecrated space within concealed chambers. The religious requirements for proper chapel configuration, correct orientation toward the east when possible, proper altar construction, appropriate decoration, needed to be accommodated within the constraints of concealment. Some hidden chapels were simple chambers with minimal religious furnishing, while others were elaborately decorated despite their concealment, demonstrating that even hidden sacred space deserved appropriate ornament in the eyes of devout builders. The contents of hidden chapels typically included an altar, which might be portable or permanently installed, along with the necessary liturgical items for celebrating Mass or other religious services. The sacred vessels, chalice, paten, ciborium, made from precious metals added to the chapel's spiritual significance, while also representing valuable objects that the concealment protected. The chapel might contain relics, particularly if the family possessed sacred objects that they valued highly. Some hidden chapels included small libraries of religious texts, prayer books, and devotional literature that provided resources for private worship. The priest holes that appeared particularly in English Catholic houses during Elizabethan and later periods represented specialised form of hidden chapel-related space. These concealed chambers provided hiding places for Catholic priests who conducted illegal masses in Protestant England. The priest holes were ingeniously constructed by specialists like Nicholas Owen, who created hiding spaces within chimneys, beneath floors, behind panelling, and in other locations where priests could conceal themselves during searches by priest hunters. The spaces were often tiny, barely large enough for a person to crouch in uncomfortable positions, but they saved many priests from capture and execution. The accompanying equipment needed for conducting clandestine religious services would also be hidden in priest holes or in connected storage spaces. The vestments needed for Mass, the altar furnishings, the wine and hosts, the religious texts, all these needed concealment when religious authorities might search the building. Some priest holes included special storage compartments for this equipment, separate from the space where the priest himself would hide. The complete system of concealment ensured that religious practices could continue despite persecution, while minimizing the evidence that could be used in prosecutions. The acoustic considerations for hidden chapels were important. The sounds of religious services, prayers, singing, the bells used in certain rituals, could potentially reveal the existence of hidden chapels if sounds carried to parts of the castle where hostile listeners might hear. The builders of secret chapels needed to position them where sounds wouldn't escape, or needed to provide sound insulation through thick walls and careful architectural design. The tension between wanting proper religious observance and needing absolute concealment shaped how these spaces were designed and used. The famous examples of priest holes include many discovered in English country houses and some castles. The spaces at Harvington Hall, Hindlip Hall, and numerous other locations demonstrate the sophisticated engineering involved in creating hiding spaces that could defeat determined searches. The ingenuity shown, hiding places accessible only through secret mechanisms, spaces concealed in plain sight where searchers looked but didn't find, connections between multiple hiding places allowing movement during searches, testifies to the high stakes involved and the seriousness with which both Catholics maintaining their faith and authorities, trying to suppress it, approach the conflict. The betrayal risks surrounding hidden chapels and priest holes were substantial. A servant who revealed their location, a disgruntled family member, or a captured priest who was tortured into revealing hiding places could all lead to discovery. The trust required to maintain secrecy extended to entire households in some cases, with many people knowing about concealed spaces and all needing to remain silent, despite rewards offered for information and despite the legal dangers of concealing priests. The relative success of many priest holes in protecting priests demonstrates that this trust often held despite the pressures. The discoveries of hidden chapels during building renovations or archaeological work continue occasionally even today. Some discoveries have revealed previously unknown spaces preserved in remarkable condition, with altar furnishings, religious art and other contents surviving centuries of concealment. These findings demonstrate that not all hidden spaces were discovered during their periods of use, and that castle architecture continues to yield secrets as investigation techniques improve and as chance renovations expose previously sealed spaces. The religious conflicts that made hidden chapels necessary varied across Europe and across time periods. In England, the Protestant Reformation and subsequent religious settlement made Catholic practice illegal at various periods, requiring concealment. In regions that remained Catholic, Protestant minorities sometimes required similar hiding places. During various persecutions of Jewish communities, some houses included hidden synagogues or ritual bath facilities. The universality of religious persecution across different faiths and regions meant that hidden religious spaces appeared throughout Europe, wherever religious minorities needed to practice their faiths in secret. The psychological importance of hidden chapels for those who used them exceeded their practical function as mere hiding places. The space represented continuity of faith despite persecution, defiance of religious oppression, and maintenance of spiritual life despite enormous risks. The hidden chapel was simultaneously practical necessity and powerful symbol of faith's persistence in face of attempts to suppress it. The prayers offered in concealed spaces carried additional weight from the danger that offering them involved. The modern preservation of discovered priest holes and hidden chapels has made them tourist attractions and historical monuments, sites where visitors can appreciate both the architectural ingenuity and the historical circumstances that made such spaces necessary. The interpretation of these spaces requires balancing respect for the genuine religious conviction and suffering involved with honest acknowledgement of the religious conflicts that characterized early modern European history. The hidden chapels testify to both the best and worst of human nature, the persecution that made them necessary, and the faith and courage that led people to create and use them despite the risks. Understanding hidden chapels and priest holes reveals how religious identity could be matter of life and death in medieval and early modern periods, requiring architectural concealment for survival. The spaces represent the intersection of faith, politics, and architecture in circumstances where belief required courage, and where survival demanded ingenuity in creating spaces that could protect vulnerable religious practice from powerful political and religious authorities determined to enforce conformity. The hidden weapons storage spaces within castles served strategic defensive purposes by distributing arms throughout the structure, ensuring that defenders could access weapons quickly, regardless of where fighting occurred. Understanding these concealed armories reveals sophisticated defensive thinking about internal castle architecture as a component of overall military planning. The primary armories in castles were well-known spaces where the bulk of weapons, armour and military equipment was stored, yet relying solely on centralised armories created vulnerabilities. If enemies gained control of the armoury, or if routes to it were blocked during fighting, defenders might be unable to access weapons when needed. The solution was distributing smaller weapons caches throughout the castle in hidden locations that defenders knew about but that attackers wouldn't discover immediately. The typical contents of hidden weapons caches included swords, spears, axes, maces, and other hand weapons that would be immediately useful in close combat. The weapons stored in these distributed locations were usually simpler, more standardized items rather than the elaborate or ceremonial pieces that might be displayed in main armories. The purpose was practical, ensuring that defenders could quickly arm themselves wherever they were in the castle when fighting began. The quantity in each cache would be enough to equip several men, creating redundancy across multiple hiding places. The ammunition storage for missile weapons was particularly important to distribute. The crossbow bolts, arrows, and stones for throwing or for siege engines needed to be positioned near the walls and towers where they would be used. Storing all such ammunition in central locations would be inefficient and potentially catastrophic if those locations were captured or destroyed. The distributed storage meant that each defensive position could be supplied from nearby hidden stores, rather than requiring transport through potentially contested internal spaces during fighting. The armour stored in hidden locations tended to be simple, functional pieces rather than the elaborately decorated armour that lords and wealthy knights possessed. The mail shirts, helmets, and other protective equipment in distributed caches would be used by common soldiers and servants pressed into defensive roles when the castle came under attack. The availability of these distributed armour stores meant that more defenders could be equipped more quickly than if everyone had to reach a single central armoury. The concealment methods for weapons caches included building storage spaces into wall thickness, creating false panels in wooden walls, hiding weapons beneath floorboards or in ceiling spaces, and constructing dedicated chambers accessible through hidden doors. The best concealed caches looked like solid walls or floors from casual observation, revealing their contents only to those who knew the mechanisms to open them. The concealment protected weapons from theft during peacetime, while keeping them accessible when needed for defence. The positioning of weapons caches reflected strategic thinking about castle defence. The caches would be placed near gates and other vulnerable points where fighting was most likely to occur. They would be distributed across different levels and sections of the castle, so that defenders throughout the structure could access weapons. The locations would be chosen to be reachable from living areas where defenders might be when attacks began. The distribution pattern created a redundant system where loss of any single cache wouldn't cripple overall defensive capability. The maintenance of hidden weapons required periodic inspection and care to prevent deterioration. Metal weapons could rust, wooden components could rot, bowstrings could deteriorate. The distributed nature of hidden caches made maintenance more challenging than caring for weapons in a single central location, yet the tactical advantages of distribution justified the additional effort. The responsibility for maintaining these caches typically fell to the Marshal or Master of Arms, who oversaw all military equipment. The secrecy around cache locations had to balance operational security with tactical utility. The defenders needed to know where weapons were hidden so they could access them quickly during emergencies, yet limiting knowledge to only trusted individuals reduced risks of betrayal or theft. Some castle lords apparently used a tiered system, where senior defenders knew all cache locations, while common soldiers knew only about caches in their specific areas of responsibility. The discovery of hidden weapons caches during castle sieges could significantly affect battle outcomes. Attackers who gained entry to castles and who discovered unexpected weapon stores would realise that resistance might be stronger than anticipated, and that the defenders had more resources than initially apparent. Conversely, defenders might deliberately lead captured sections of castle to have defenders fall back to areas where hidden caches could rearm them, turning apparent retreat into preparation for counterattack. The historical accounts of castle defences occasionally mention weapons appearing as if from nowhere, when defenders seemed exhausted or when attackers thought resistance would collapse. These accounts probably describe the use of hidden weapons, caches that allowed defenders to continue fighting, longer than attackers expected. The surprise factor of defenders suddenly rearmed could turn battle momentum and might convince attackers to negotiate rather than continuing costly assaults. The distinction between hidden weapons caches and trapped weapons needed to be clear to defenders while being invisible to attackers. Some castles included weapons stored in locations that appeared accessible but that were actually trapped. Attempting to seize the weapons would trigger defensive mechanisms. The distinction between legitimate caches for defenders and trapped caches designed to injure attackers required clear knowledge that needed to be transmitted to defenders, while being completely concealed from enemies. The peaceful period uses of hidden weapons caches were limited but did exist. During normal times, when castles weren't under threat, the hidden weapons provided security against internal threats. A riot among servants, violence during festivals when strangers entered the castle, or unexpected attacks by visitors who proved hostile. The ability to quickly access hidden weapons allowed lords and their trusted retainers to respond to internal security threats without the visibility of openly carrying weapons constantly. The transition from medieval castles to early modern fortifications saw continued use of distributed weapons storage, even as architectural styles changed. The principle that weapons should be available throughout defensive structures, rather than concentrated in single locations, remained sound, even as the specific weapons changed from swords and crossbows to firearms and gunpowder weapons. The distributed storage of powder and shot became even more important due to the dangers of concentrating explosive materials in single locations. Understanding hidden weapons caches reveals that castle defenders thought systematically about internal architecture as component of defence, rather than simply focusing on external walls and gates. The distributed weapon system created resilient defensive capability that couldn't be easily neutralised by capturing single locations. The hidden caches represented sophisticated understanding of how actual fighting within castles would unfold, and represented practical preparation for the reality that battles might penetrate into castle interiors, where having pre-positioned weapons could mean the difference between successful defence and defeat. The hidden passages, spy holes, and listening chambers that allowed castle lords to observe and overhear conversations without participants' knowledge represented sophisticated surveillance architecture serving political and security purposes. Understanding these features reveals the paranoia and practical caution that characterized medieval life, where information could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The spy holes, small openings through walls that allowed observation of adjacent rooms, were positioned to provide views of important spaces without being visible from the observed side. The holes might be disguised as decorative elements, as gaps in stonework that appeared to be normal construction variation, or as openings hidden behind movable panels or tapestries. The technical challenge was creating holes that provided good viewing angles while being completely invisible to people in the observed spaces. The listening chambers were concealed spaces adjacent to important rooms, where someone could position themselves to overhear conversations through walls thin enough to transmit sound. These chambers were typically narrow spaces created within wall thickness, accessible through hidden doors from passages or from private rooms. The person listening would remain in darkness and silence, hearing conversations from the adjacent room without any ability to be detected from the other side, unless they made noise or unless someone knew to check for the hidden space. The purposes of surveillance architecture included multiple practical concerns. The Lord wanted to know what his own household members were discussing when he wasn't present. Were servants loyal or plotting? Were guests who professed friendship actually harbouring hostile intentions? Were visiting nobles who claimed to be allies actually negotiating against him? The ability to observe and listen covertly provided information that people wouldn't share if they knew they were being monitored. The surveillance features were fundamentally about information gathering in an environment where information meant power and where betrayal was constant threat. The strategic positioning of spy holes and listening chambers focused on rooms where important conversations would occur. The great hall where the Lord entertained guests would likely have surveillance features. The guest chambers where visiting nobles would stay might be monitored. The council rooms where advisors met might have hidden observation points. The chapel where private conversations might occur, assuming religious privacy, would sometimes include surveillance features that violated the sacred nature of the space in service of political necessity. The famous historical examples include some well-documented surveillance systems. The Château d'Amboise in France has passages within walls that allowed movement throughout the building without being seen, with viewing holes into various rooms. The castles of various Italian city-states included sophisticated surveillance features, reflecting the intense political competition and frequent betrayals that characterized Italian Renaissance politics. The papal apartments in the Vatican include passages and surveillance features that served security and intelligence gathering functions. The servants who assisted in surveillance operations would need to be completely trustworthy, since they would hear and see information that could be politically explosive. The Lord might listen personally in important cases, but much routine surveillance would be delegated to trusted retainers whose discretion was essential. The career of a successful spy within a household could be lucrative, as the value of good intelligence justified generous compensation. Yet the risks were substantial. Discovery of one's role in spying could lead to execution by those who were being monitored. The acoustic design of listening chambers required careful attention to sound transmission. Walls needed to be thin enough that conversations could be heard clearly, but needed to appear normal from the observed side to prevent detection. Some listening chambers included sound amplification features, concave surfaces, or tubes built into walls, or other design elements that enhanced sound transmission. The medieval understanding of acoustics wasn't as sophisticated as modern knowledge, but practical experience taught builders what worked. The secrecy around surveillance features was essential for their effectiveness. If people knew they were being monitored, they would adjust their behaviour, defeating the purpose. The knowledge of surveillance systems was typically restricted to the Lord and his most trusted confidants. The existence of spy holes and listening chambers was sometimes rumoured, but often not definitely known by most castle occupants. The uncertainty about whether one was being watched created an atmosphere of caution that served the Lord's interest even without actual monitoring. The discovery of surveillance features by those being monitored could have serious consequences. Visitors who discovered spy holes might consider themselves insulted, potentially damaging political relationships. Household members who learned they were being monitored might become resentful or might become more actively disloyal in reaction. The careful concealment of surveillance architecture was necessary to prevent these negative reactions while still gaining the benefits of covert information gathering. The ethical questions about surveillance were recognised even in medieval periods. The violation of privacy, particularly in spaces like bedrooms or chapels where people expected confidentiality, troubled some moralists. The Church's position on the seal of confession and on the sacred privacy of religious observance created theological arguments against certain surveillance practices, yet the practical political realities of medieval power meant that lords who valued survival over abstract ethics generally maintained their surveillance capabilities regardless of moral objections. The limitations of surveillance architecture included the physical constraints of where viewing holes and listening chambers could be positioned, the difficulty of monitoring multiple spaces simultaneously, and the challenges of interpreting what was observed or overheard without full context. The surveillance provided fragments of information that needed to be pieced together with other intelligence sources to create full understanding of situations. The system was valuable but not comprehensive, providing useful insights rather than complete knowledge of everything happening within castle walls. The comparison to modern surveillance technology is instructive. Medieval lords wanted the same thing that modern surveillance systems provide: the ability to monitor what people are doing and saying without their knowledge. The medieval technological limitations meant they achieved this through architectural features, rather than through electronic monitoring. But the fundamental purpose was identical. The historical continuity of surveillance as tool of power reveals how consistently authorities across ages have sought information advantages over those they govern or compete against. The transition to early modern periods saw continued, and even expanded use of surveillance architecture as palace complexes became larger and more complex. The royal palaces of absolutist monarchs included extensive networks of secret passages and observation points that allowed monarchs and their spies to monitor courtiers. The architectural sophistication of surveillance systems reached peaks in buildings like Versailles, where Louis XIV maintained elaborate intelligence-gathering capabilities that helped him control his nobility. Understanding surveillance architecture reveals the darker side of castle sophistication. The features designed not for comfort or defence, but specifically for covert monitoring of people who thought they had privacy. The spy holes and listening chambers represented architectural manifestation of the paranoia and suspicion that characterized medieval power relationships. The spaces created practical capability to gather intelligence that could prevent betrayals, or that could identify treachery before it became dangerous, yet they also represented profound violation of trust and privacy that created atmosphere of suspicion within castle walls. The surveillance features were simultaneously prudent security measures in dangerous times and corrosive influences on trust and relationships within the communities living in spaces where walls literally had ears and eyes. As this exploration of castle hidden spaces concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition that medieval castles were far more architecturally complex than their imposing exterior suggested, containing entire hidden geographies that served purposes ranging from practical security to political intrigue to survival in desperate circumstances. The castles that tourists visit today, with their visible towers and battlements, represent only the public face of structures that were actually layered with concealed spaces serving functions that their builders considered too sensitive or too valuable to expose to public knowledge. The practical purposes of hidden spaces demonstrates medieval understanding that security required more than visible defences. Treasuries protected wealth through concealment as much as through guards and locks. The escape passages provided insurance against the possibility that visible defences might fail. The secret prisons allowed political prisoners to be held without public knowledge or legal process. The hidden chapels served religious needs that had to remain private for safety or devotion. The distributed weapons caches ensured that defenders could continue fighting, even if attackers penetrated deep into castle interiors. The surveillance features provided information that helped lords navigate dangerous political situations. Each type of hidden space served specific practical purposes that visible architecture couldn't accommodate. The engineering sophistication required to create effective hidden spaces was substantial. The builders needed to create concealed chambers within walls, without leaving obvious signs of their existence. They needed to construct secret passages that extended beyond castle boundaries, without being detected during excavation. They needed to design entrances and access mechanisms that would remain hidden, yet still be usable by those who knew their secrets. The technical challenges of creating functional hidden spaces while maintaining their concealment required expertise that went beyond ordinary construction skills, creating specialised knowledge that was valuable and closely guarded. The knowledge management surrounding hidden spaces created complex questions about who should know what. Some secrets were shared only between Lord and perhaps one or two completely trusted retainers. Other secrets were more widely known within family circles but kept from servants and guests. The tiered access to knowledge about castle secrets reflected the hierarchical nature of medieval society, while recognising that some information was too dangerous to share widely. The management of this knowledge across generations, ensuring that heirs learned about family secrets while maintaining overall confidentiality, required careful succession planning that sometimes failed, leading to knowledge being lost as older generations died without properly transmitting it. The betrayal possibilities that hidden spaces created added layers of vulnerability even as they provided security. A servant who knew about hidden treasuries could lead thieves directly to the most valuable assets a family member who revealed escape passages to enemies could trap, rather than save those trying to flee. The priest hole builder who was captured and tortured might reveal the locations of hiding places across multiple houses. The surveillance system meant to protect lords could be turned against them if the watchers became enemies. The hidden spaces were simultaneously protective and potentially dangerous, depending entirely on whether knowledge of them remained with trusted allies or fell into hostile hands. The archaeological rediscovery of hidden spaces continues providing new insights into castle architecture and medieval life. The modern technologies, including ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and laser scanning, reveal spaces within castle walls that weren't previously detected. The physical investigation of castles during restoration work occasionally exposes hidden chambers that had been sealed and forgotten. These discoveries demonstrate that not all hidden spaces are known even today, and that castles likely contain additional secrets waiting to be revealed through future investigation. The ongoing discoveries suggest that our understanding of castle architecture remains incomplete, and that future research will continue revealing previously unknown features. The romantic mythology surrounding castle hidden spaces has elements of truth alongside considerable exaggeration. The treasure chambers existed, though probably not with the overflowing wealth that fantasy depicts. The secret passages were real, though they probably led shorter distances and served more practical purposes than legends suggest. The oubliettes and secret prisons were genuine horrors, though perhaps less universally present than Gothic fiction claims. The priest holes saved lives during religious persecution, though their use was concentrated in particular times and places rather than being universal castle feature. The surveillance architecture served real information-gathering purposes, though probably less comprehensively than paranoid imagination might suggest. The balance between historical reality and romantic elaboration characterises popular understanding of castle hidden spaces, making it important to distinguish documented features from imaginative speculation. The modern preservation questions about hidden spaces raise interesting challenges. Should discovered hidden chambers be restored and open to public viewing, or should they remain concealed as they were historically? Should escape passages be made accessible for tourism despite the safety risks of medieval passages that weren't designed for modern liability standards? Should priest holes and secret prisons be preserved as monuments to historical realities, even when those realities involve suffering and persecution? The answers vary by site and circumstance, but the questions reveal tensions between historical preservation, public access, and appropriate commemoration of past events that were sometimes triumphant and sometimes tragic. The lessons about security architecture from castle hidden spaces retain some relevance, despite completely different technological contexts. The principle of defense in depth, multiple layers of security rather than reliance on single protective measure, remains valid whether applied to medieval castles or modern computer networks. The concept of distributed resources, keeping backups in multiple locations rather than concentrating everything in single point of failure, appears in castle weapons caches and in modern data management strategies. The recognition that surveillance provides information advantages that can prevent threats has driven security architecture from medieval spy holes to modern camera systems. While the specific technologies have changed completely, some underlying strategic concepts persist across centuries. The human stories behind hidden spaces deserve remembrance alongside architectural appreciation, The nobles who commissioned secret chambers to protect their family's security and survival faced real dangers that justified the enormous investments in hidden architecture. The prisoners who suffered in secret cells experienced horrors that historical distance shouldn't diminish into mere architectural curiosities. The priests who hid in cramped spaces and the families who risked everything to shelter them demonstrated courage driven by religious conviction. The builders who created these spaces exercised sophisticated skills while sometimes keeping dangerous secrets. Behind every hidden space were human decisions, human suffering, human courage, or human cruelty that architecture preserves in stone. As light returns and this journey through castle-hidden spaces concludes, what lingers is appreciation for the complexity layered within structures that appear simple from outside. The castles that dominate European landscapes with their proud towers and thick walls contained within those visible structures, entire networks of concealed spaces serving purposes that range from prosaic storage to high political intrigue to matters of life and death. The hidden chambers, passages and rooms represented invisible geography, known only to those with privileged access, creating dual realities where the castle everyone could see coexisted with the castle, known only to its lords and their trusted confidants. The secrets concealed within medieval walls remind us that architecture is never merely functional or aesthetic, but rather embodies the priorities, anxieties, and values of those who commissioned it, preserving in physical form the complex realities of medieval life where security and survival often depended on what could be hidden as much as on what could be displayed. The hidden archive chambers within castles served as secure repositories for documents, records, and written materials that held political, legal, and economic power. Understanding these concealed document storage spaces reveals how medieval and early modern lords recognized that paper could be as valuable and as dangerous as gold, requiring protection through architectural concealment as much as through guards and locks. The importance of documents in medieval power structures cannot be overstated. The charters proving land ownership, the marriage contracts establishing alliances, the treaties defining political relationships, the financial records tracking debts and obligations. All these written materials formed the documentary foundation of medieval society. The loss or destruction of crucial documents could cost families their lands, their titles, or their lives. The protection of these papers therefore became priority that justified elaborate security measures, including hidden storage chambers. The construction of hidden archives involved creating environmentally controlled spaces within castle walls where documents could be preserved for generations. The chambers needed to be dry to prevent paper deterioration, protected from fire yet accessible when needed, secure against theft yet organised for efficient retrieval. The architectural challenge was creating spaces that met these sometimes conflicting requirements, while remaining completely concealed from anyone who shouldn't know about them. The typical contents of hidden archives included the most sensitive and most irreplaceable documents, rather than routine administrative records. The founding charters granted by monarchs establishing family rights to lands and titles would be protected in hidden archives. The marriage contracts and dowry agreements that documented family alliances, and that might need to be referenced or proven generations later, required secure storage. The correspondence with powerful figures that documented political relationships, or that might be used as evidence in future disputes, needed protection from both destruction and from being read by enemies who might use the information against the family. The genealogical records and family trees that documented lineage and proved noble status represented another crucial category of archived materials. In societies where status derived partly from ancestry, the documentary evidence of family history held enormous value. The careful maintenance of genealogies showing connections to royal lines, to ancient noble families, or to legendary figures provided the documentary foundation for status claims. These records needed protection both because of their intrinsic value and because falsified genealogies were common enough that protecting authentic records from substitution or alteration was important. The financial records documenting loans, debts, and obligations formed another vital category. The bonds showing that others owed money to the family, the records of mortgages held on others' properties, the documentation of trade agreements and business partnerships, all these represented economic power that required protection. Conversely, the records of family debts needed to be protected from creditors who might seize them. while also being preserved so the family knew exactly what they owed. The complete financial picture of a noble family existed in documentary form that needed secure archival storage. The organisation systems for hidden archives varied from simple storage in locked chests to elaborate filing systems with documents categorised by type, by date, or by importance. The larger and more sophisticated families maintained detailed catalogues of their archives, though these catalogues themselves were sensitive documents since they revealed what materials existed. Some families used coded cataloguing systems that would be meaningless to anyone discovering them without the key to the code. The balance between organisation enabling efficient retrieval and security preventing unauthorised access shaped how archives were managed. The access protocols for archives required multiple levels of authentication. Some archive chambers had multiple locks, requiring different keys held by different family members, ensuring that no single person could access archives alone. Others used combination mechanisms requiring specific sequences of actions to open. The physical access was typically restricted to the lord, the heir, and perhaps one or two completely trusted officials who managed family records. The strict control over access reflected the sensitivity of archived materials, and the potentially devastating consequences if they fell into wrong hands. The preservation challenges for medieval documents required constant attention. Paper and parchment deteriorated from moisture, from insects, from mould, and from simple aging. The most valuable documents might be copied periodically to ensure that even if originals degraded, the content would survive. Some families maintained duplicate archives in different locations, protecting against the possibility that fire or other disaster might destroy primary storage. The effort invested in documentary preservation demonstrates how highly families valued their written records. The famous historical examples of hidden archives include some that preserve materials of enormous historical value. The Medici family maintained extensive archives documenting their banking operations, their political negotiations, and their patronage activities that now provide invaluable historical records. Various noble families across Europe preserved archives that now form the documentary foundation for understanding medieval and early modern European history. The survival of these materials often depended on the security of the storage facilities that protected them for centuries. The betrayal risks surrounding archives were substantial. A disloyal family member, a treacherous servant, or an enemy agent who gained access to hidden archives could copy documents revealing family secrets, could destroy evidence of legitimate claims, or could steal materials that could be used for blackmail or political manipulation. The security of archives therefore required not just physical protections, but also careful vetting of anyone who knew about their existence and location. The destruction of archives during conflicts represented deliberate strategic acts aimed at destroying families' documentary foundations. When castles were captured, attackers would often specifically target archive chambers if they could be found, burning documents to eliminate their enemies' ability to prove claims or to document relationships. The historical record shows numerous instances where the destruction of family archives accompanied physical defeat, ensuring that the conquered families couldn't use documentary evidence to recover position or to press claims in future. The discovery of hidden archives during later periods sometimes revealed documents of enormous historical importance that had been forgotten. The finding of sealed chambers containing medieval records has occasionally provided historians with primary sources that shed new light on historical events. These discoveries demonstrate that effective concealment could preserve documents across centuries, while also showing that knowledge of archive locations was sometimes lost as families died out or as castles changed hands. The legal importance of archived documents meant that possession of certain papers could determine outcomes of inheritance disputes, could prove or disprove claims to titles and properties, could establish or refute the legitimacy of marriages. The strategic value of documents made them targets for theft, for forgery, and for destruction. The families who successfully protected their archives across generations maintained documentary foundations for their claims and status that families whose archives were lost or destroyed couldn't match. The transition from manuscript documents to printed materials didn't immediately reduce the importance of hidden archives. Even in early modern periods when printing made documents more common, the unique materials specific to particular families, original charters, correspondence, financial records, remained manuscript materials requiring secure storage. The archive chambers continued serving crucial protective functions even as the broader documentary culture changed. The religious dimensions of some archive contents added spiritual significance to practical importance. Families might preserve papal bulls granting privileges or dispensations, letters from saints or religious figures, or other documents with religious as well as secular value. These materials required protection both for their practical implications and for their sacred significance, making mixed archives of secular and religious materials common in hidden chambers. Understanding hidden archives reveals that medieval and early modern families recognized documents as forms of power, requiring protection, comparable to that given to treasure and weapons. The papers stored in concealed chambers represented the documentary evidence of status, wealth, rights, and relationships that defined families' positions. The architectural concealment of archives protected not just physical materials, but the documented memory and legitimate claims that formed foundations of power across generations. The hidden chambers containing documents were simultaneously practical storage spaces and symbolic representations of how carefully families guarded the written records of their power, their rights, and their history. The concealed laboratories, workshops, and study chambers within some castles served as spaces where lords and scholars could pursue alchemy, early scientific investigations, or other intellectual activities that might attract suspicion, mockery, or accusations of heresy. Understanding these hidden spaces of knowledge production reveals the intellectual ambitions of some medieval and early modern nobility, and the reason such pursuits required concealment. The practice of alchemy combined proto-scientific experimentation with mystical philosophy, seeking to transform base metals into gold, to discover the elixir of life, and to uncover nature's deepest secrets. The pursuit was taken seriously by many educated people from antiquity through the early modern period, with practitioners including respected scholars, wealthy nobles, and even monarchs. Yet alchemy also attracted criticism as deceptive charlatanism, or as dangerous trafficking with demonic forces. The combination of genuine interest and social suspicion made concealed laboratories useful for those pursuing alchemical studies. The construction of hidden laboratories required creating spaces with specific features for experimental work. The chambers needed good ventilation to remove dangerous fumes from heating and distillation processes. They required heat sources, furnaces or fireplaces, capable of sustained high temperatures for various alchemical operations. They needed storage for chemicals, minerals, and other materials used in experiments. The spaces needed to be sufficiently isolated that strange smells, unusual lights, or sounds from experimental work wouldn't attract attention or alarm other castle residents who might report suspicious activities. The typical contents of alchemical laboratories included elaborate apparatus for heating, distilling, and otherwise processing materials. The alembics and retorts used for distillation, the crucibles for heating materials to high temperatures, the various vessels for mixing and storing chemicals. All these specialized equipment items would be present in functioning laboratories. The more sophisticated laboratories might include complex apparatus like circulation systems that could maintain processes running for extended periods. The investment in equipment could be substantial, representing significant commitment to alchemical pursuits. The materials stored in laboratories included various minerals, plant materials, and chemicals that alchemical recipes required. Mercury, sulfur, and salt were considered fundamental substances in many alchemical traditions. Various other minerals and metals, acids and alkalis, organic materials from plants and animals. The range of materials used in alchemical work was extensive. Some materials were expensive or difficult to obtain, requiring connections to import exotic substances. The storage of these materials needed to account for their sometimes dangerous or volatile properties. The books and manuscripts that alchemical practitioners consulted represented another important laboratory component. The texts by classical authorities like Jabir ibn Hayyan and later alchemists provided theoretical frameworks and practical instructions. The manuscripts were often difficult to obtain and expensive, representing substantial investment in themselves. Some texts were written in code or used symbolic language that required specialized knowledge to interpret. The library component of alchemical laboratories could be as valuable as the physical equipment. the secretive nature of alchemical knowledge contributed to the need for concealment. Alchemical texts emphasized that true knowledge should be revealed only to worthy initiates, that casual revelation of secrets would be both dangerous and ineffective. The tradition of secrecy meant that even legitimate practitioners generally worked in private, rather than publicly demonstrating their activities. The hidden laboratory accommodated this tradition while also providing practical protection against unwanted attention. The patronage of alchemy by nobility reflected both genuine intellectual interest and more mercenary hopes of discovering gold-making secrets that could solve financial problems. The enormous costs of maintaining noble lifestyles and meeting political obligations meant that many nobles were chronically short of money despite apparent wealth. The possibility that alchemy might provide means to create gold from cheaper materials attracted serious interest from financially strained aristocrats who invested in alchemical equipment and hired skilled practitioners to conduct experiments on their behalf. The famous noble alchemists included some significant historical figures. John Dee, while not noble by birth, served Queen Elizabeth I and conducted alchemical studies supported by noble patrons. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II maintained extensive alchemical laboratories and supported numerous alchemists at his court in Prague. Various other nobles across Europe dabbled in or seriously pursued alchemical studies, creating networks of practitioners and patrons that fostered experimental investigation even when theoretical frameworks were problematic. The transition from alchemy to chemistry gradually occurred as experimental methods improved and as theoretical understanding of matter evolved. Yet the transition was gradual, and the boundary between alchemy and early chemistry was fuzzy. Many practitioners who made genuine contributions to chemical knowledge still worked within alchemical frameworks. The hidden laboratories where alchemical work occurred were in some cases the same spaces where early modern chemistry developed, making them sites of genuine scientific progress despite the mystical trappings. The medical dimensions of alchemical work contributed to its practical value beyond gold-making fantasies. The preparation of medicines, the distillation of spirits and essences, the creation of ointments and salves, all these pharmaceutical activities fell within alchemical practice. Some noble practitioners were primarily interested in medical applications, seeking to develop effective treatments for diseases or to create strengthening tonics and life-extending preparations. The medical work gave alchemical laboratories practical purpose that justified their existence even when transmutation remained elusive. The architectural challenges of incorporating laboratories into castle structures included managing risks of fire and toxic fumes. The heating operations necessary for many alchemical processes created fire hazards that could endanger entire castles. The fumes from various operations could be noxious, or even lethal if not properly vented. The laboratory design had to balance experimental needs against safety requirements, creating spaces that were functional while minimizing risks to occupants and structures. The servants and assistants who worked in hidden laboratories needed special skills and required the trust of their patrons. The laboratory assistants performed much of the routine work of maintaining fires, monitoring processes, and handling materials. Their knowledge of their lord's activities and their access to expensive equipment made them potentially dangerous if disloyal. The selection and compensation of laboratory staff required care to ensure both competence and discretion. The disappointments that alchemical pursuits generally produced, the failure to create gold, the unsuccessful searches for immortality elixirs, sometimes led to disillusionment and abandonment of laboratories. Yet the persistence of alchemical traditions across centuries despite consistent failure to achieve proclaimed goals demonstrates the powerful appeal of the promises and the genuine belief that success might be just one more experiment away. The abandoned laboratories found in some castles testify to both the serious pursuit of alchemical goals and the eventual recognition that they were unattainable. The other secret workshops beyond specifically alchemical laboratories included spaces for other activities that required concealment. Some nobles maintained workshops for creating sophisticated mechanical devices, early automata, or other technological projects that they wanted to develop away from prying eyes who might steal ideas or mock failed experiments. The impulse to tinker, to experiment, to develop new capabilities drove creation of hidden spaces where such activities could proceed without interference or scrutiny. Understanding hidden laboratories and workshops reveals that some medieval and early modern nobles pursued intellectual interests that required privacy and concealment. The laboratories represented spaces where curiosity about nature's secrets could be explored, where experimental work could proceed away from skeptical observers, and where the pursuit of transformative knowledge, whether finding gold or discovering medicines or simply understanding how the world worked, could be conducted seriously despite social pressures that might inhibit such activities if conducted openly. The hidden chambers where alchemists mixed their materials and where experimenters tested their hypotheses represented the intersection of architecture, intellectual ambition, and the social constraints that made concealment necessary for pursuing knowledge that mainstream society viewed with suspicion or contempt. As this comprehensive exploration of castle hidden spaces concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition that medieval and early modern castles were extraordinarily complex architectural systems where the visible structures represented only partial reality. Behind and within the imposing stone walls existed entire hidden geographies, networks of concealed chambers, secret passages, surveillance points, and storage spaces that served purposes ranging from mundane practicality to high political intrigue to desperate measures for survival. The castles were simultaneously what they appeared to be from outside, and something far more complicated and layered in their actual internal reality. The practical engineering sophistication required to create all these hidden spaces while maintaining their concealment demonstrates remarkable technical capability. The medieval and early modern builders who incorporated secret chambers into castle designs needed to understand structural engineering well enough to maintain building integrity, while creating voids within walls. They needed to grasp acoustics sufficiently to design listening chambers and to prevent sound leakage from places that needed to be silent. They needed to manage water flow for hidden cisterns and drainage for underground passages. They needed to create concealment mechanisms that would function reliably across decades or centuries. The architectural expertise required was substantial, representing high level of technical knowledge that was itself valuable and carefully guarded. The social stratification that hidden spaces embodied reflected broader medieval hierarchies. The lord and his immediate family knew secrets that trusted retainers didn't share. The senior retainers knew things that ordinary servants couldn't know. The servants closest to the family knew more than those working in outer areas. The tiered access to knowledge about hidden spaces mirrored the tiered social structure, where information access correlated with position in household hierarchy. The architecture literally embodied social hierarchy through creating spaces that only certain people could access or even know existed. The economic resources invested in creating hidden spaces were substantial. The construction costs for secret passages, concealed chambers, and elaborate concealment mechanisms represented significant expenses beyond what visible castle construction required. The ongoing costs of maintaining hidden spaces, of storing supplies in concealed locations, of managing complex security systems, all these consumed resources that could have been deployed for other purposes. The willingness to invest these resources demonstrates how highly castle lords valued the security, privacy, and strategic advantages that hidden spaces provided. The psychological dimensions of living in spaces where walls literally contained secrets created atmosphere of mystery and unease for those aware that hidden chambers existed, without knowing where all of them were. The knowledge that one might be observed through hidden spy holes, that passages allowed movement through walls, that chambers existed whose purposes weren't disclosed. All this created an environment where privacy was illusory, and where complete knowledge of one's surroundings was impossible. The psychological impact of hidden architecture contributed to the broader culture of suspicion and surveillance that characterized medieval political life. The military strategic value of hidden spaces in castle defense extended beyond their specific contents to include the general principle that concealment created unpredictability that complicated attackers' planning, the uncertainty about what hidden resources defenders possessed, where escape routes might lead, what surveillance capabilities existed. All this uncertainty favoured defenders by forcing attackers to prepare for possibilities. They couldn't verify the hidden architecture, thus contributed to defence through creating strategic fog of uncertainty, as much as through the specific tactical advantages of individual hidden features. The loss of knowledge about hidden spaces across generations created situations where castles contained secrets that their own occupants didn't fully know, as families died out, as castles changed hands, as records were lost or destroyed. The comprehensive knowledge of hidden systems was sometimes lost, even though the spaces themselves physically remained. The rediscovery of such lost spaces continues occasionally even today, revealing that medieval builders created concealment so effective that knowledge could be completely lost while the concealed spaces endured across centuries. The romantic mythology that has grown around castle hidden spaces reflects cultural fascination with secrets, with hidden knowledge, with the idea that ordinary seeming places might contain extraordinary concealed realities. The treasure hunt narratives, the secret passage adventures, the mysterious disappearances into oubliettes. All these tropes from literature and popular culture have some grounding in historical reality, even when specific stories are exaggerated or invented. The cultural power of castle hidden space narratives demonstrates how effectively the idea of architectural secrets captures imagination. The modern ethical questions about how to interpret and present hidden castle spaces are complex. Should the spaces where prisoners suffered be preserved as monuments to historical cruelty, or should they be closed as too disturbing? Should secret passages be made accessible to tourists despite safety concerns? Should the surveillance architecture that violated privacy be explained and displayed, or should such features be minimized to avoid celebrating problematic aspects of past? The answers vary by specific context, but the questions reveal tensions in heritage interpretation between historical authenticity and contemporary values. The technological advances in building investigation continue revealing previously unknown hidden spaces. Ground-penetrating radar can detect voids within walls without invasive investigation. Thermal imaging can identify temperature differentials suggesting concealed chambers. Laser scanning creates precise three-dimensional maps that reveal anomalies suggesting hidden architecture. These technologies mean that castle exploration continues discovering new secrets, suggesting that even the most thoroughly studied castles may contain additional hidden spaces awaiting discovery. The cross-cultural comparisons reveal that hidden spaces within fortifications and elite residences weren't unique to European castles. Japanese castles incorporated concealed passages and surveillance features. Chinese palaces had secret chambers and hidden routes. Ottoman fortifications included similar security architecture. The universal appearance of hidden spaces in elite architecture across cultures suggests that certain needs, for security, for privacy, for strategic advantage, drive similar architectural solutions regardless of cultural context. The lessons about security architecture that castle hidden spaces teach remain relevant despite completely different technological contexts. The principle of defense in depth through multiple security layers, the value of concealment alongside visible protection, the importance of controlling access to sensitive spaces, the strategic advantages of uncertainty and unpredictability. All these concepts translate across radically different technological contexts, from medieval stone construction to modern digital security. The underlying strategic thinking persists, even when specific implementations differ completely. The human experiences of those who built, used, and were confined in hidden castle spaces deserve remembrance beyond abstract architectural appreciation. The builders who created these spaces exercised remarkable skills while keeping dangerous secrets. The lords who commissioned hidden chambers were simultaneously providing for family security and creating capabilities for political intrigue and oppression. The prisoners who suffered in secret cells experienced horrors that historical distance shouldn't diminish. The priests and religious minorities who sheltered in hidden spaces demonstrated courage driven by conviction. Behind every hidden space were human decisions, human experiences, human courage or cruelty that architecture preserves in enduring form. The incomplete historical record means that much about castle hidden spaces remains unknown, and probably unknowable. The most effectively concealed spaces might never be discovered. The purposes of some discovered spaces remain ambiguous. The stories of what occurred in hidden chambers are mostly lost to time. The gaps in knowledge are themselves historically significant. They demonstrate that concealment worked, that secrets were kept, that medieval architecture still holds mysteries despite centuries of investigation. The acceptance of historical uncertainty alongside documented knowledge characterizes honest engagement with castle hidden spaces. As light returns and this extensive journey through castle hidden spaces concludes, what remains is profound appreciation for the architectural complexity and the human ingenuity that created dual realities within castle walls. The visible castle that dominated landscapes and that housed aristocratic life coexisted with the invisible castle of concealed passages, hidden chambers, and secret spaces known only to privileged few. The hidden architecture served purposes spanning from prosaic storage to desperate survival to high political intrigue, creating capabilities that visible structures alone couldn't provide. The secret chambers, the hidden passages, the concealed surveillance points, the emergency caches, all these represented responses to genuine needs and genuine threats that medieval people faced. The architecture of secrecy wasn't mere paranoid excess, but practical adaptation to realities, where survival often depended on what could be hidden, as much as on what could be displayed. The hidden spaces were tools that served their creators' purposes, while also revealing the anxieties, the ambitions, and the often harsh pragmatism that characterized medieval and early modern life. The castles still standing across Europe and beyond contain within their walls stories written in stone, stories of treasure protected, of prisoners confined, of escapes accomplished or prevented, of surveillance conducted, of supplies cached for crises, of political plots hatched in hidden rooms. The architecture preserves in physical form the complex realities of societies, where power required both display and concealment, where security demanded both visible strength and invisible preparation, and where the most important secrets were literally built into the walls of the structures that housed and protected those whose power shaped history. The hidden spaces within castles remind us that architecture is never simply what it appears to be, but rather embodies in physical form the priorities, fears, ambitions and secrets of those who commissioned it, creating structures that were simultaneously homes, fortresses, prisons, treasuries, refugees, and countless other things depending on which spaces one could access and which secrets one knew, demonstrating that even seemingly simple stone walls can contain extraordinary complexity when human ingenuity and human need combine to create invisible geographies within visible structures.